Good morning and welcome to Sunday at the Marxist Library, except that we're not at the Marxist Library now that the pandemic has hit the world. So we meet mostly by Zoom. So it's good afternoon to Dan Kovalik in Steeltown. And good afternoon, I guess, to Richard Wright in the Independent Oblast of Texas. And to all of you all around the world that might be listening. So thank you so much for joining us. This is the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. It's put on by the ICSS, the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. We have a little program committee, and I'm on the program committee. My name is Roger Harris, and we've been doing these programs for about a decade and a half, and we're very proud in making this a platform for the open exchange of progressive ideas. We have a culture of respect and of different ideas. Ourselves, we are the ICSS itself is a explicitly Marxist background, and we put forward our motto that of our organization is that and it comes from Marx, his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, where he says that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, and we're very happy to have as our speaker today someone who is working on changing it. Dan Kovalik is an international human rights lawyer. He previously worked for the United Steelworkers as counsel for them, and now he is very, very active in international human rights activity. He graduated, and he teaches right now at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He graduated from Colombian University School of Law in 1993, and that he has written very extensively on a number of topics of progressive interest. He has a number of books to his credit, including a number of books that were the plot to overthrow Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and those topics. He has a book coming out right now on Nicaragua that I'm very much looking forward to. Dan got his start really in Nicaragua and is really one of the really important spokespeople for explaining the importance of the Nicaraguan revolution. He appears frequently on RT and in the blogosphere, and I could go on and on because Dan does so much and does it so well. But rather than going on with that, we have him in person. So Dan, why don't you take it away? Thank you for coming and joining us. Unmute, please. Dan, please unmute.
So first, I want to thank you, Roger, because you are a dear friend and comrade, and I appreciate you so much. And you're the only person who I would give up watching the Steelers play the Browns today. In any case, I am very happy to be here, and I feel very relaxed with you. I just got back from Troy, New York, where I was speaking with Scott Ritter. It was a very contentious audience we had there. By the way, I didn't know this. I just learned this. Did you know that James Connolly lived in Troy, New York for 2 years? I didn't know that. So you learn things every day. But in any case, I'm glad to be here. And I do want to acknowledge one other person who is no longer with us. And that's Bob Baldock, who was a dear man. He fought with Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra. He died in October. And he was always a big supporter of me at KPFA and in the Bay Area. And I just, that's a big loss. I don't know if he was a member of your library. I assume he probably was. But I just want to acknowledge him and say Bob Presente. With that, I want to talk to you about Russia and Donetsk. I was in Russia for a month in November. I actually went there for 10 days and I stayed for a month in order to finally get into Donetsk, which is a bit of a tricky thing to do these days, as you can imagine. And as I'm going to have a little different talk than I would have for a general audience, because you are Marxists, so there are things of relevance and interest to you that might not be of interest or even understood by others. So first of all, let me talk about the Russia proper part of my trip, because I found that as interesting as anything. It was the first time I was ever in Russia, first of all. I never made it to the Soviet Union. I was a very young man when the Soviet Union collapsed, though I was very sad when it did. I understand there's probably people who are in this group who have different feelings about the Soviet Union, but I think the world was a better place with it. And what I found, and this, of course, is supported by Poles in Russia and other former Soviet republics, is that most Russians agree with me about that. Most Russians miss the Soviet Union. A lot of Russians told me that. And very, kind of everyday Russians, people you might not expect to say that, but there's a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet Union there. And which I was happy to see. I was happy to see that a lot of the monuments to the Soviet leaders are still there. A lot of monuments to Lenin are still there. A lot of buildings that still have hammers and sickles and other things. Those haven't been defaced or torn down or whatnot. And I think the one thing to say about Russia that I came away with is that I believe Russia is in an ongoing existential crisis. And what do I mean by that? After the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think a lot of Russians, I think Russia in general, is trying to come to grips with its history. It's very long and winding history, which includes the Soviet era. And I'll give one example. So I was in Red Square at the 105th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was very exciting. I mean, that was like a lifelong dream to be there at that time with people with red flags and whatnot. And that's on, of course, November 7th. That used to be a national holiday. It's no longer a national holiday. What is a national holiday is November 4th. And it commemorates the Russian victory over Poland in the 1600s. Okay, that's what's replaced the celebration of the October Revolution, which says a lot, right? I mean, okay, that's what you're going to celebrate now, the victory over Poland in the 1600s. I mean, but this shows that there's a struggle. A struggle in the minds of Russians. Who are we? What is our history? What do we do with the Soviet era? What do we do with the Stalinist period? The one thing people agree on, and in fact, what I was told is that this has become much more important in celebrations and in the national discourse than even during Soviet times, and that is the Great Patriotic War. Everyone agrees that was maybe the greatest moment for Russia, was the defeat of the Nazis. And that is celebrated again in ways and romanticized in ways, I was told by Russians, that they didn't see even during Soviet times, that it's become really a preoccupation and obsession with Russians, because I think it's something they can agree on. And in fact, in front of Red Square, and I don't know how long it's been there, maybe it's been there many, many decades, but in any case, in front of Red Square, when you get there, the big statue is not of Lenin, it's not of Stalin, it's not of Peter the Great, it's of Marshal Zhukov on horseback, right? Marshal Zhukov is, again, everyone can agree on him. There's a big mural, it's a beautiful mural, looks newly painted in old Arbat Street, which is where I was staying. Again, the leaders, the military leaders from that time are, heroes, and again, no one will dispute that. So that's what I think people cling to in many ways is World War II, which of course makes the falsification of history by the West even more painful, which of course is the denial of the Soviet contribution to that war, which has become an increasing thing over the years, of course. I think most Americans probably do not know what the Soviets did in defeating Hitler and how many people they lost and all that. And of course, that is a relevant thing in terms of the discussion of what's happening in Ukraine and the Donbas. Because people, particularly in Donetsk, where I was at, link their struggle now to the Great Patriotic War. In fact, Donetsk, up till 1961, up to the de-Stalinization by Khrushchev, was known as Stalino. And there is a kind of battle cry amongst people in Donetsk: first Stalingrad, now Stalino. The idea, of course, being that the Nazis were turned back in Stalingrad, and they're going to now be turned back at Stalino, now known as Donetsk. Now, this is a very profound idea, of course, which I had never heard before I stepped foot in Donetsk. I had never heard that phrase. But that is how the people of Donetsk see their struggle. They believe, and I believe they're right, but the way they look at the world is that they are on the front line of fighting fascism and have been so since 2014. In fact, I met an old guy there who is famous as a hero because in 2014 he helped almost single-handedly turn back or destroy invading forces by Ukraine and by Poland, by the way. Poland's been involved in this conflict since the beginning in 2014. I don't know if you know that, but been a lot of Polish troops involved, mostly wearing Ukrainian uniforms, but nonetheless. So anyway, he and 7 comrades chanced upon a major tank and troop mobilization by Kiev, again, along with these Poles, at this old World War II monument, which it's up high and it overlooks the Azov Sea. It's this very kind of dramatic spot, but a place where of entry for these troops. And he was greatly outnumbered with only him and 7 other comrades. So he called on the Donetsk militia group to shell his position in order to fight this mass of people invading the Donetsk. And he called in 3 different shellings to do that. And they were able to defeat this major attempt at an invasion in 2014. But that's a long way to say that when he was telling us this story, he would often refer to the invading forces as Germans, kind of as a Freudian slip. But again, I think it's important to see that that is the mindset, not of just people in Donetsk, but people in Russia. They see this as Operation Barbarossa #2. They see this as a war by the collective West against Russia. And when you accept at least that that's their position and perception, it certainly gives you, I think, an important, vantage point of what's happening. The other thing I learned in Donetsk, and I didn't know this, the second largest mass grave of the Nazis in World War II is in Donetsk. There was a concentration camp in Donetsk, And the Nazis threw about 75,000 bodies into this mass grave, essentially, as I understand it, down the piping of a big factory. Many people alive. 75,000. And there's still a memorial to those people and to that mass grave there. Again, this is, I think, to understand the psyche of people in Donetsk, you have to know that. And know that for them, that was yesterday that happened. And in every city, of course, you go to in Russia, or at least in Western Russia, which is where I was. So I covered all the way from Leningrad to Moscow to Rostov-on-Don into Donetsk. That's a huge swath of Western Russia. But of course, Russia has 11 time zones. I was only within one. I think I crossed a time zone once into Donetsk, but which of course gives you an idea of the size of Russia. But I covered a good deal of Western Russia, and there's of course major World War II monuments in every city, which stands to reason. And by the way, the other thing about the Donbas, I think you have to understand, and again, I'm just learning these things myself. So first of all, Ukraine itself was part of Russia for many centuries. In fact, Kiev was the first capital of Russia, even before Moscow was created. So that's an important thing to realize. But the other thing is that the Donbas portion of Ukraine was even part of Russia during the first years of the Soviet Union. It was actually the industrial heartland of Russia and the Soviet Union. And so it really is a newcomer to this Ukraine. And it's been treated as such, of course, as we know, since 2014. They have been treated as the Untermenschen by the right-wing government in Kiev. These Russian speakers, and that is why the conflict developed in 2014, in which 14,000 people, as we know, died in that conflict, even before Russia intervened directly in February of 2022. And of course, there were Nazis involved in the invasion of the Donbas. The Azov battalions won, but many others, you know. So again, all of this has reverberations for the people there. An interesting story I was told by a guy named Igor, who is from Odessa, which is not in the Donbas. He is from Odessa, but he joined the Donetsk militia in 2014, just out of a moral, decision to defend those people against the invasion by Ukraine. And he, last summer, was part of the forces, joint Russian and Donetsk militia forces, who finally flushed out the Azov battalion from that steel mill, the big Azov steel mill in Mariupol. You might recall this was one of the most bloody battles of the conflict that lasted for weeks. And the Azov battalion was hunkered down in these bunkers in the steel mill that were built during Soviet times. They were built to defend the Soviet Union against an invasion. Under the steel mills. And he said each level, listen to this, this is insane. Each level had a different smell. And why? Because within the ranks of the Azov, this neo-Nazi Azov battalion, it was very hierarchical. With the top leadership on top, they got the best food, they were able to shower, etc. And then as you went progressively downward, you had the lower ranking people who barely got any food and were, so he said it had a different smell in each level. In the bottom smell, the bottom level having the most sickening smell. I was very struck by that description. But the other thing he made a point to tell me was that when they defeated the Azov Battalion at this steel mill, they did not raise the Donetsk People's Republic flag. They did not raise the Ukrainian flag. They did not raise the Russian flag. They raised the Soviet flag over the steel mill. And what I was struck by, a lot of people told me this, some in Russia proper, I mean, Moscow and St. Petersburg, but I heard it much more in Donetsk. People saying they don't consider themselves Russians. They don't consider themselves Ukrainians. They consider themselves Soviet peoples. And they see part of their struggle now as defending the spirit and ethos of the Soviet Union, to the extent that the best quality of the Soviet Union was its attempt to unite all these different ethnic groups with all these different languages in one nation of republics, where at least theoretically each republic was equal to another. And the idea was to overcome ethnic conflict, right? And try to unite on a class basis, right? That was at least the idea of the Soviet Union, which I'm sure all of you know was founded exactly 100 years ago in December of 1922. And so that's been celebrated as well. In fact, Luhansk, the other Donbas republic, has a coin that it minted to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Soviet Union. But I found that very interesting. Even younger people, when I say younger, even people in their 30s who maybe were like little babies before the Soviet Union collapsed, some of them told me, oh yeah, I'm a Soviet. That's what I am. And I was very touched by that, very moved by that, of course. And it gave me a very different feeling about what's happening in Donetsk and Luhansk. And what I told someone is this, at least with my own political feelings and predilections, I would say that, when I look at people I would most like to be in the world, I often think of Jack Reed, the American who recorded, but also really worked with the Russian Revolution in 1917 and after, and who became friends with Lenin and who's now buried in the Kremlin. And I have often romanticized him and thought, oh, that's the way to live. That's the guy you want to be, And truthfully, when I was in Donetsk, I felt like, oh, wow, I thought that time was past. You couldn't be that guy anymore. But then I felt in Donetsk, you could be that guy or woman again. That history is repeating itself. And it's the history that I care most about. And I thought, what a lucky person I am. Other people, they might want to relive the U.S. Civil War, you have Civil War reenactors or whatever. The fight against fascism and the fight for the Soviet Union, those are things, to be able to somehow relive that and be part of it is pretty exciting to someone like me, and maybe to some of you as well. And when I talked to people about it, they totally understood what I was saying, because they feel that way. Again, a lot of people in Donetsk feel that way. And one of the big, what I was told, the big beginning of the crisis and conflict in Donetsk city was when fascists came in 2014 to try to bring down the Lenin statue, giant Lenin statue in Lenin Square in the middle of Donetsk city. And many residents from Donetsk came out to defend the Lenin statue and to defend, symbolically the legacy of the Soviet Union. And judging by the fact the Lenin statue is still standing, they clearly won. And again, that was very profound to me. And a guy who, if you met him, he's a lawyer and, just seems like a regular guy. He told me about that story, and he told me he himself went and fought. He said, yeah, I got my dukes up to defend the Lenin statue in 2014. I mean, that's just a part of this story that I think is not being told at all, Now, again, for many Americans, they wouldn't even understand what the hell that story means. But for those of us, on this Zoom call, obviously we do understand. And that was a very amazing story for me, an amazing moment for me, So now I guess I'll cut to the chase a little bit again, and I'm happy to answer questions and whatnot. I mean, maybe I'm not covering the issues that folks are most interested in, but again, from a Marxist point of view, these are the stories that really interested me. I talked to people, including this guy named Igor, the guy from Odessa who went and fought side by side with the people in Donetsk, and who made a point to show me the photo of the Soviet flag foisted over the steel mill in Mariupol. And I said, well, and so he's part of the leadership in the Donetsk People's Republic, and he's got his pulse on what's happening. So I was very interested. That's right. Someone said, well, it's likened to Americans maybe defending a statue of Washington or Lincoln. I think that's true, But what Igor told me, I asked Igor a couple things. I said, first of all, well, you call yourself the Donetsk People's Republic. I said, that sounds like an old socialist republic, right? That's what, a lot of these socialist republics were called. North Korea calls itself that. And I said, are you trying to build socialism? Is that your goal? And he said, we discussed that early on. And, he said, right now, no, that really isn't the goal. It's more to, defend the homeland. And then I asked him, and I asked a number of other people, do you think, there's a desire to recreate the Soviet Union? And he said, yes. He said, I don't think it can be recreated in the way it was. It'll never be what it was. But yes, he said, we would like to see some form of the Soviet Union recreated, and they see, again, being a People's Republic as part of Russia is kind of at least a facsimile of that. So I found that very interesting. And I think there's discussions being had in Russia about that. Certainly the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is one of three communist parties in Russia, which considers itself the successor to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and which is the second largest party of any party in Russia, is pretty open about the fact it would like to restore the Soviet Union. It actually put a motion in the Duma that the flag of the Russian Federation itself be changed from the tricolor flag to the old Soviet flag. I'm not sure that went anywhere. But that, I think there's a desire for that. And again, I think a lot of people would welcome that in many ways. But again, whether the socialist part of that, right? The socialist part of the USSR, that's a part that's maybe a little more contentious amongst people, whether that's what they would want. But again, I think people definitely harken back to that time. And I'll just tell you some stories people told me. So the first person I met when I came to Moscow was a woman named Olga, and she works for RT. And I didn't ask her age, but I would say she's probably in her 40s. And she told me, she was very proud to tell me that she grew up as a child during the Soviet times. And she also made a point to tell me she got in the frontiers, you know, their boy and Girl Scouts. She got in the frontiers on the first round. She said those were the best kids, right? The others got in on the second or third round, but I got in on the first round. She was very proud to tell me that. And she talked to me about the Soviet days because she could tell I was interested in that. And she just talked about, you know, there was more of a ethos of cooperation then. You know, kids were more apt to help each other in school. Teachers were more apt to stay after school for free to help kids that were, you know, behind. And she remembers that, and she remembers that very fondly. Other people told me this, you know, said, well, you know, one of the things we say about, you know, the transition from the Soviet Union to, you know, post-Soviet days comes down to locks and gates. Locks and gates. And they said during Soviet times, there weren't locks and gates. You could go anywhere you wanted to because you owned everything. And as long as you didn't damage anything, the whole world was your oyster, you know. And that changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's when the locks and the gates returned, you know, from the Tsarist days or whatnot. And that made a huge impression on me as well. So I was happy to see, again, that the Soviet spirit is not dead. It lives. How that's going to play out, you know, in the future is hard to say. But that is interesting. The other thing that happened when I was there, you probably saw this, was that President Miguel Diaz-Canel from Cuba was in Moscow. And he and Putin went and laid wreaths at the feet of the new Fidel Castro statue in Moscow, which I went to visit before I left. And I found that interesting as well. And Putin gave a speech calling Fidel, you know, a hero of international solidarity. Again, that was of interest to me. You know, again, that Russia, obviously we cannot conflate Russia with the Soviet Union. That would be a big mistake. And I know that many people do that from the left and the right for their own reasons or by accident or by, you know, just sloppiness. But again, I think also it's my own view is history does not stop on a dime either. That what was created in 1917 in the spirit of solidarity, both amongst Soviet peoples and also internationally, that did not die in 1991. It still exists, and it's still something that's important to people. And I took that, you know, away with me when I left. And again, I felt that most, you know, strongly in Donetsk. I felt very at home there and very happy to be there. And felt like the world was changing in a dramatic way and that it was changing on the axis that was in this little bit of contested territory in the Donbas. And I think the people in the Donbas feel that themselves. They feel they're on the forefront of history, of a new moment. And in part to try to, you know, try to deal with some of the contradictions that were left when the Soviet Union collapsed, you know. So anyway, why don't I end there for at least my remarks in chief. And I'm happy to answer any questions and hear any comments. But those are at least my initial thoughts and feelings upon leaving Russia. And by the way, I've already bought my ticket to return there in April. I really caught the bug, and I want to go back as soon as possible. So there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for very, very moving and convincing and just a very nice presentation. So thank you for that. We're going to take a short break here, do some housekeeping announcements, and then we'll come back for the Q&A. So Gene or Alan, do you want to announce our upcoming programs?
Go ahead, Gene. Well, next week, I'll start with next week. We have, next week is Jeff Monson, who is located in Moscow, and with Don Corder, who appeared back in 2021 at Sunday mornings, have made a documentary about Donbas. It's called 8 Years Before. We strongly recommend that everybody watch it. We've sent out the link with the announcement. It's also posted on the website to watch the documentary. And Jeff will be speaking about his experiences in Donbas. I've been communicating with him on Telegram this week about the library and the presentation. And he was actually quite kind of surprised at some of the things that I told him about Western coverage and the Western media about what's going on there. And I think it's going to be a very interesting firsthand exploration and discussion of what's taking place in Donbas. So next week, take a look at the website for the actual documentary. Gene, take it over for the next ones. Unmute yourself, please.
He wrote on the message that he can't unmute.
Okay, that's right. All right.
Unmute him.
Go ahead, Gene. Thank you, Mehmet.
We should note Gene's hat. I love Leningrad. Is that what it says?
Yes, I was going to say that I was fortunate. I took a tour of the Soviet Union in 1989, and that included Leningrad. And so, and I was really impressed with Leningrad and the memory of the war. It's said that every Soviet family, every Russian, every Soviet family has a close relative or member who was killed in the Nazi invasion, in the fight. And that's one thing that the Russians, have played the leading role in fighting fascism. And I think that's sometimes left out. But where was I? We have, you said Jeff Monson is coming, and that's going to be good. And you can see all this on our website, ICSSmarks.org, and you can also sign up for our weekly reminders there and urge people to do that. Following that, we have nuclear weapons and the Ukraine crisis with Mark Albertson, who is with us now, but we're looking forward to that. Tentative on the following that, the militarization of the police with Steve Martineau. And then on February 5th, Hitler's rise to power with Mark Albertson again. And then going down to February 12th, Yusuf will be talking about Stalin's Marxism and the problems of linguistics, which I think will be, many of us are interested in. And then on the 19th of February, we have John Walsh speaking on China's dynamic zero COVID policy, facts from the East and fictions from the West. So again, we have some good programs coming up, and I'm looking forward to them, and I know you are. And again, urge people to sign up for our weekly reminders. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Gene, and thank you, everybody, for attending. Now we go into the question and answer part of our presentation. And the rule here is that we invite you to raise your hand. I'll look for hands. and I'll call them in order as well as I can do that. And that to make either a statement or a question, but to limit it to about 2 minutes. And there's a lot to cover here. So we're going to ask you to be kind of disciplined about how long you speak. And Alan will be timing people. And if you do go over, just for the good of making everybody having an opportunity to speak, and if you can't discipline yourself, we will mute you and go on to the next speaker. So please go by those group rules. Dan, you raised some very important questions, but also it's such a big topic. There's so much more that we need to cover, particularly how to build a movement for peace. Yes. I'm very pleased to see Baba Azad is with us, who's one of the leaders in the peace movement, and hopefully we'll hear from him as well. But let's just open this up. I see hands up now. The stack looks like it's Raj, Sahai, Richard Wright, and then you, Jean Rule. So Raj, take it away, please.
Okay, thank you, Dan, for very engaging, and I would almost feel like I was there with you. I would love to go there as well, especially the spirit of Soviets is really impressive to hear. So I have two what seem like hostile questions, but because they're not hostile, because I understand them a little bit differently, but they have been asked and presented. One of these mainstream media, since you were in Moscow for almost a month, you engaged with ordinary people. Is Putin viewed in Moscow the same way as is viewed in American mainstream media? So that's the first question, as kind of a oligarch whose whole thing is to basically get rich and doesn't care, cruel man who runs a oligarchic system. And is that the impression you got from talking to ordinary people or not? I'd like to hear that, your impressions. And second, in Donetsk Republic, there was a hostile question to you in New York yesterday, which I don't think either you or Scott really addressed. One of them was a guy said there are 14,000 people who died, you mentioned, between 2015 and 2022 before Russia launched this special military operation, but that you didn't say that there were 4,000 of them were the Ukrainian forces, 6,000 were Donetsk militia people, and about a little less than 4,000 were civilians. So you try to minimize and try to put you in a place of having credibility problems. You can clarify that a little bit if you choose to do so. Thank you.
Yes. So first of all, thanks for your questions. A couple things. First, I wanted to just say in regards to the Leningrad hat that you probably could still get that hat because the station, the train station that will take you to St. Petersburg is still called Leningradsky Station in Moscow. They have not changed the name of the station. So that's a nice thing. And again, you see that a lot. By the way, almost every city I was in had a Lenin district. There's different districts in every city. Everyone still has a Lenin district. So that's an interesting thing. By the way, Finland Station in St. Petersburg still has a giant statue of Lenin in front of it. And in fact, a terrorist tried to bomb it, and it was injured at some point, and the city fathers had it, rebuilt fairly recently. So that just interesting little thing. Okay, so I'll answer your second question first. And I did think I did respond to that guy. What I did say is, look, I'm not going to dispute your figures on who was killed during that time. I think that's probably pretty accurate. What I didn't say is the following, because I didn't think it was going to go over well, but I will say it to you all, that when you talk about 6,000 Donbas militia forces being killed, I kind of view that a little I see them as quasi-civilians in the sense that these were people.
I can't hear him.
Dan, you
is
cut.
having
Dan,
some
couldn't hear you.
bandwidth
Last
issues.
Maybe temporarily turn off your video, Dan. Try that.
Okay.
All right, good. Got it. We hear you.
Okay. So I'll just repeat that. Responding to Raj's second question, which is a fair one. What I didn't say at the event, what I did say at the event in response to that question was, well, look, first of all, if we just agree 14,000 people were killed since 2014, what we're agreeing on is this war did not start in February 2022, as the media has been trying to tell us. So that's an important thing. But what I didn't say, I said, look, I'll accept the figures you're giving me because I think they're pretty accurate. But when you say that 6,000 Donbas militia people were killed, I don't view the militia people as purely military people. I would call them quasi-civilians, because what you had, and I met many of these people, you had women, you had elderly men, you had people from all walks of life picking up arms to defend themselves against their own government who was attacking them. To just say that, oh, well, they're just soldiers is just not right, I don't think. I would say if you combine the 6,000 militia people with the 4,000 civilians, you're looking at 10,000 people in the Donbas who were killed. Okay, so that means 10,000 of the 14,000 people, first of all, were in the Donbas. So that's 2/3 of the people killed were of the Donbas, which means so they took the brunt of the war. And also nearly every soldier from Ukraine who was killed in the Donbas because they were invading the Donbas. So, you know, that's the way I would view those figures. And I think if you view the figures that way, I think it gives you a fair sense of the conflict from 2014 to 2022. I did not get into that militia issue, you know, considering them quasi-civilians, because I'm not sure that guy would have appreciated that or that would have gotten me anything. But I think you can all understand that point. The thing about Putin, first of all, in Moscow, Moscow's a little different than a lot of the rest of the country. It's more affluent. It's a little more middle class, upper middle class. So I would say there people have more of probably a conflicted feeling about Putin because they're very pro-Western too. Moscow's very pro-Western in a way that the hinterlands are not. You know, the real Russia, and I was told this by Muscovites, the real Russians live outside of Moscow, right? The salt of the earth, in a way that New York City doesn't really represent the rest of the country. If you lived in New York and you never left New York, you wouldn't have a very good view of what America was really like, is the truth of it, right? But even say,
We lost him.
Dan, we lost your audio again. Can you Dan, we lost your audio again. Maybe turn off your video part temporarily.
yeah, I'm going to do that.
Okay. Temporarily.
Yeah. Okay. But you can hear me now.
Yep.
Okay. What everyone agrees on is that the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were the worst times in Russia since World War II. It was crime-ridden. Gangs were running the streets. It was awful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So everyone agrees on that. No one has a romantic view of the Yeltsin years, okay? What else people I think agree on is the last 20 years under Putin, Medvedev have been some of the best years. That really Putin got things in order in Russia. Things are much better now. And I saw that in Moscow. Moscow was honestly, and I'm not exaggerating, I've never seen a cleaner, more orderly city. Especially compared to U.S. cities. You know, in Pittsburgh, I live downtown. It's filthy. A lot of homeless, a lot of vagrants. You didn't see that in Moscow at all. At all. The subways were clean. You could eat off the subway platform. I mean, it was night and day compared to the U.S. Putin really, you got to give him credit for bringing back a certain amount of prosperity and social order to Russia, and I think a lot of people give him credit for that. I think what probably people in Moscow, as opposed to people, again, in other areas, they're probably more divided on the question of this war, probably more against it in Moscow than at other places. But you've seen the polls. I mean, in general, about 80% of the population supports the war effort. But again, I would say in Moscow, probably that percentage is less because it is a very, again, kind of middle class. I'm going to try to turn on my video. Kind of middle class, pro-Western city. And in fact, let me just tell you something. If you speak English, not just Moscow, but St. Petersburg as well are very hospitable places to be. Most of the menus are in Russian and English. And I even went to an opera in Leningrad at the old opera house, and there was English subtitles scrolling above the stage. Okay, so, but Moscow in particular is very international in that way. If you speak English, you can get by just fine. People speak English, signs are in English. But that gives you an idea that it's a little more kind of geared towards the West than, again, a lot of the areas. So they have a different view. But again, I think Putin gets credit for doing a lot of positive things for the country and kind of getting it back on its feet, which I think everyone would give him credit for that. So I don't think they view him at all the same way the West views him. The other thing, of course, is when we talk about Putin, when we even talk about the Soviet Union, I mean, I always hear Michael Pereny in my brain. I wish he were, I know he lives in Berkeley, but I know he's getting older. I wish he were on this call. I wish he were around to really speak these days. We could use Michael. But, you know, what Pereny would always say, you know, when they talk about, oh, the communists took away our democracy in the East Bloc, and he'd be like, what democracy? These were monarchies and, you know, before the communists took over. You know, there was no democracy to steal. And honestly, when you talk about Putin, I mean, you know, was Yeltsin a Democrat? I mean, he bombed his own Duma. In fact, I went to I met a very nice Russian man who gave me a tour of Russia at night. We walked 5 miles at night. He would have walked me 10 miles, but I was exhausted. But he just couldn't wait to take me to the next thing. But the first thing he took me to was the memorial for the people in the Duma who were killed by Yeltsin. He shelled his own frickin' Duma, killed over 100 people, mostly Congress people and mostly communists, in 93, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a memorial to those people to this day. So again, the idea, oh, Putin's this authoritarian guy, he stole our democracy. I mean, what are you even talking about, right? I mean, the view of the world and what democracy is and all that is very different in Russia than it is here. And of course, you know, when you really, and then when you think about how democratic our country is, again, I just think it becomes kind of laughable, the view of the Western media on Putin and on most things. I mean, they just don't really comport with anything that is really real. So, but, you know, the Russians are interesting. The thing that struck me, and I talked to people about this, and they agreed that my impressions were right. The one thing I found about Russians, I find them to be very self-effacing and very humble. And as one woman told me, she said, yeah, Dan, we're a little too humble for our own good. You know, I mean, I think they do feel a little cowed by the West and do feel that influence of that Western criticism. And I think that was a big thing, by the way, that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think they took all that stuff way too seriously. You know, they have a bit of an inferiority complex when it comes to all that. So, you know, it's not that they were completely immune from those Western criticisms. At the same time, their reality is nothing, you know, does not comport with what the West is saying. So,
Thank you, Dan. Next up on the stack is Richard Wright, followed by, let's see, Gene Rule, followed by Mark Albertson, followed by Youssef, and followed by Janet Coben. So Richard Wright, it's all yours. If we can, there's so much to find out from Dan. So keep the questions within a 2-minute or so limit, please. So Richard, you need to unmute.
There we go. Okay. Okay. I wanted to comment real quickly on your comment about the militia in Donbas, in that there's a comparable use of the military in this country, and that is that more and more we're calling on our reserve, you know, the Air Force reserves and the Army reserves to do the fighting and training for us. Now, admittedly, these are more people that have been trained by the military in large measure, but nevertheless, they are a reserve army that has that's being used more and more in military. Also, I've been noticing that there's a large increase in what are called the private military contractors in the Donbas area, well, in Ukraine in war. Okay, so my question is this. Could you be a little bit more specific over the demographics of the people that you talked with? In particular, did you talk with, is there any sort of discernible difference of perspective based on age, one, or in large measure in the Donbas area, that's a lot of peasantry down there, a lot of farming that's going on. And I'm wondering if there's any difference between their perspectives and what you'd find in the city too, and whether you brought up the issue of the Chinese. Are there any perspectives on the Chinese in your meetings? Thank you.
sure. So first of all, no, I didn't really talk to anyone about China, so I can answer that question very quickly. In terms of the demographics, again, in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, I'm often talking to more kind of middle-class professional types. Again, many of whom, again, depending on age, I do think age is important, are very nostalgic for the Soviet Union, even if they're a professional or whatever. And part of it is if they lived during that period. I would say, obviously, it's hard to be nostalgic for a time you didn't live in. So yeah, obviously older people are more nostalgic. I'll tell you a very interesting thing, a little anecdote, for example. But that's not totally true. For example, I saw, and I tried to take photos of this, and I'm sorry, I wish I were more technologically savvy because I'd show you some of these photos. When I went to Red Square the first day, of course, that's the first place I went, right? So the first thing I did, I got off the plane. I went right to Red Square. I'll tell you a few things. I stood in line, of course, to go see Comrade Lenin at the mausoleum. And it was a very long line. I would say at least 100 people. were in line. I was probably in the middle, 50 at least in front, 50 in back. And to me, again, eyeballing it, I would say these were more modest people economically. These were more working class peasant people. These were not well-dressed people. These were very people from more modest circumstances, and they were lined up with their kids to go see Lenin. And that made a huge impression on me. And they weren't all old either. I would say, in fact, most were probably middle-aged, 40s, maybe 50s. And again, with kids, families. So that was something that made an impression on me. And again, when I first got to Red Square, I also noticed a lot of little kids wearing those big fur hats with the hammer and sickle in them. And I took a lot of photos of kids like that. And I really enjoyed that. And again, what does that mean to them? I'm not sure. But again, even amongst the young, there's a certain, at least, nostalgia for the Soviet days. I will tell you a very interesting thing, I think. So when I got to St. Basil's Cathedral, which of course is probably the most famous building in Red Square, everyone gets their photo in front of that. There were these older women, and I would say they were, I don't know, 60s, 70s, and they had these scarves, these very traditional scarves. I would call them kind of peasant. They were dressed as peasants, I would say. And they were lined up together with their scarves getting a photo op in front of St. Basil's. And so I went up to them. I was very, very forward with people because I was so excited. And I said, hey, can I get my photo with you? And they said, oh, sure, sure. And I stood right behind him. And my young friend who was giving me a tour, she said, oh, these people are from Volgograd. And the women in unison yelled out, Stalingrad. You know, they were very clear. We're not from we don't know what you're talking. We're from Stalingrad. And there's still, again, when it comes to Stalingrad, there's still this real feeling about Stalingrad and what it means. And in fact, the city fathers in Stalingrad are thinking of naming it back to Stalingrad, you know, so that was interesting. But they were older people. I'm not sure younger people would have had the same feeling, but that made an impression on me. Yes, I mean, again, I think in Donetsk, I was with more working class people. First of all, you're right. It is agricultural, and I'm sure you know it has some of the richest soil on earth. They have this black soil, which they made a point to show me. And it is black. Like, I've never seen soil like that unless it was wet. And it is some of the richest soil on earth. And there is farming. But also, it is an industrial heartland. In fact, Donetsk city was a sister city with Pittsburgh because it was a steel town like Pittsburgh. And in fact, its steel industry, like Pittsburgh's, was created by a Scotsman. Just like Pittsburgh's was created by Andrew Carnegie from Scotland, theirs was created about 100-some years ago by a Scotsman. And I'm going to try to remember his name. He has a very common name. But anyway, that's an interesting thing, an interesting connection between Donetsk. So it's very working class and very peasant. I mean, it really, and again, it was the heart of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks had a huge base in Donetsk, in the Donbas, which is, again, why this is such an important region even now, because it has that history. Because this was the industrial heartland of Russia and the Soviet Union. So, so I spent time with workers and farmers there. And again, I think those people tended to be more pro-Soviet, more pro-socialist, and at this moment more pro-Putin because, you know, he finally did send troops in to the Donbas. I mean, if it were up to them, Russia would have come in 8 years ago. I mean, that is very clear. I mean, people are glad the Russians are there. Let me just be clear. I didn't meet one dissenting voice on that. And it is not an occupied area. You barely saw any troops. There were barely any checkpoints. And I drove from the far east to the far west of the Donetsk People's Republic. and maybe we went through 2 checkpoints. This is not an occupied area. These people are glad. John Hughes, thank you. They said that he was Welsh, not Scottish. Thank you for that. That is a good clarification. Thank you. I don't like to confuse the Welsh and the Scots. It's not a good thing. But in any case, yeah, John Hughes. Right. And there was also John Hughes who made goofy movies like Home Alone, and I get those 2 guys confused. But anyway, I lost my train of thought there. I guess that's it.
Okay, so let's go on to the next one, which is Gene Rule.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Dan, for this. I mean, I was at you clarified things so well and amplified the things that I thought I knew. So thank you again for this. And I was at a workshop yesterday. Somebody, a major figure in the left, was saying how much we need to support the freedom-loving people in Ukraine who are fighting this good fight for us. And so it's just good to have another view. And as I recall, in Paris, I believe there is a subway station called Stalingrad.
Yes, that's true. I've been there. That's true.
Yeah, so people remember this. And I think that's very important because, again, the role that the Russians have played in fighting fascism, I think we just really need to remember that. And that's so important. And, we talk about, Russian aggression. So it's a special military operation designed to denazify and demilitarize a fascist state in Western Ukraine. So I wanted to say that. And you've kind of already answered my question in the negative about the special relationship when Xi Jinping and Putin got together at the Winter Olympics and issued this 5,000 word statement. So I didn't know, I wondered if you had any comments on that, but I kind of gathered that from the previous response, you may not. But again, anything you care to say on that would be appreciated.
Well, just that, of course, I do think this really renewed relationship between Russia and China is a very positive one in my own view. I think one of the worst things that happened to the socialist movement in the world was the breakdown in relations between China and the Soviet Union. I think that was a very unfortunate thing. And I think that the renewed relations between China and Russia are very positive. Again, I think, Russia, the nature of Russia, obviously it's a capitalist country, right? But I still think there is, it has an anti-imperialist kind of leaning towards it. And I think China and Russia are going to play an important role in undermining U.S. Hegemony. So I certainly welcome that. Again, I really didn't talk to anyone about it. I was so immersed in Russia and just trying to understand Russia. And honestly, I didn't think much about China at all during the month.
But there is this two imperialists idea that, we have U.S. imperialism, we have Chinese imperialism, we have Russian imperialism. And I just those are one of the ideas that I don't like, and I appreciate the input you've had on all this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a long stack, so let me just go through it so you know where you are on the stack. Mark comes next, then Yusef, then Janet, then Sharon, then Kit, then Dev, then Alan, and then Marilyn. So Mark, please go.
Good afternoon, Dan. I'm in the same area of the country you're in. I'm in Connecticut though, but I'm in the general area. You brought up a couple of times, by the way, the Battle of Stalingrad, which was a turning point in the war. But following Stalingrad, and in fact, I've taught a course on the Great Patriotic War, and Stalingrad is the first of a 1-2 punch in 1943. And this decides who's going to win the land campaign for the entire Second World War. And the second of that 1-2 punch was Kursk. that is the greatest air-land battle in the history of war. And this is where Hitler is no longer able to launch an offensive of any real merit anymore. This is a battle that had 1 million Germans and 2.2 million Russians, Soviets. And this battle at one point, it starts on July 5, 1943, and ends up July 22, 24, 1943. At one point, the Germans are losing 10,000 men a day. China can afford this, Germany can't. And eventually they're going to run out of gas. And like a coiled spring, Stalin's Red Army pushes west and pushes the Germans back from Kursk closer towards Eastern Europe. And this is going to set up Stalin for the Tehran Conference in November 1943. And it's an interesting period of Soviet Russian history at this point, 1943. But this is the year that puts paid to the Hitler's, any chance Hitler's going to have to win the war. This was decided at this point. You got any questions? You got any comments on that?
No, I'm glad to hear it. I mean, again, I'm fascinated by that history, and I didn't know that, and I'm glad to hear it. I don't have a comment, except that I welcome you explaining that. I think it's fascinating, and yeah, again, I wish more people understood all those dynamics.
Well, the
Great.
entire
Okay, let's go on to-
land campaign for the war is decided on the Eastern Front. It's not decided in the Pacific, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, or France. Even after Normandy, France was a secondary front.
Yes, well, that I knew. I knew that, of course, D-Day doesn't even happen until 1944. I mean, which people
Right.
don't. A pretty incredible thing. The Western Front really doesn't materialize till 1944. So.
Right.
Very good. Youssef, you're on now.
Yes, thank you very much. I very much agree with you. One short comment, one of the monuments that was destroyed, and it's very unfortunate, was a memorial to philosophical contributors to communism, or it could be just any collective endeavor. It includes Plato, I think, and certainly Sir Thomas More. So that was destroyed, and it was near the Kremlin. I saw it in 1986, and a monument to the Romanovs was put in place. Also, another short comment, the Eastern Ukraine placed in the Ukrainians, SSR. One of the reasons was to give the republic a more proletarian character, and second, also to provide the republic with industry. Okay, now to my question. In your conversations, did the Crimea come up, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the view on Crimea is just that has always been part of Russia, that it should be part of Russia. Of course, everyone knows Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, gifted Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. So really, I mean, I think, and everything, and by the way, even in mainstream, before February of 2022, when the media was at least reporting a little honesty on what was happening there, there's like a Time magazine article and others saying the polls show that the people in Crimea are very happy to be back part of Russia and are very happy. And yeah, I mean, I think the view is that Crimea is Russian and should stay Russian, and I think the Crimeans think that as well. So.
Okay, Janet Coburn. Please unmute yourself, Janet. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Okay. Thank you for this presentation, Dan. Perhaps we should see the collective West's real perspective on the current conflict in Ukraine. as fighting against the possibility of the return of the Soviet Union. And with the support of the neo-Nazis, thus it prefers Nazism over communism. You said most Americans don't know what you're going to present, what you were going to present here. So I'm wondering why you didn't give this presentation in Del Mar, New York, yesterday with Scott Ritter. I watched a recording of it. Also, based on what you did say yesterday, it appeared to me that you believe negotiations are possible. Unless I misunderstood, on what basis do you believe that? Since there seems to be no reason for Russia to trust the US, Ukraine, and or the collective West to negotiate with any of them after decades of strategic planning to weaken and take Russia down, going back to the 1992 Wolfowitz Doctrine, and actual behavior like NATO expansion, the multiple withdrawals from treaties, including the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and the JCPOA with Iran. The West turning down Russia's peace proposals, the sanctions, the deal Turkey brokered last April, the destruction of Nord Stream, and the terrorist bombing of the Crimean Bridge. I could say more, but I'll stop there. I'd appreciate your comments. Thank you again.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the negotiation issue, I mean, look, I agree with you that I think they're a long shot. Obviously, they weren't in March or April. We know now that there was probably a deal in principle between Zelensky and Putin, that Boris Johnson went to Kiev to scuttle, told Zelensky not to sign the deal. And the deal apparently would have left most, if not all, of the Ukrainian territory still in Ukraine, you know, within Ukraine, even the Donbas. That ship has sailed now. And honestly, I think it should sail. And I was very open about this in New York, that I think in the end, Donbas should, well, they should at least have a choice of whether to join Ukraine or Russia or be independent. But in the end, I don't believe that they should be back as part of Ukraine. I think Ukraine forfeited the Donbas by doing what they did to the Donbas. I mean, that is my view. But that could be a negotiated solution. That is, okay, Ukraine, you can, you know, we'll make peace with you, but the Donbas, again, should either be sovereign or part of Russia, and that would be a basis for negotiations. But I mean, so I think negotiations are at least possible, but I also think that calling for negotiations over continuing to send arms, NATO arms to Ukraine, to me is kind of a tactical, you know, position to take, you know, to say, look, the U.S. should be brokering a peace deal instead of waging war, you know, and I think that that's at least a middle ground position to try to carve out. So, but I understand what you're saying. I agree. If I wouldn't make a deal with the West for all the tea in China. I mean, we know that they, with this thing, yeah, with Angela Merkel and now Holland saying that they never intended to abide by the Minsk agreements. It's incredible. I mean, these people are terrible. But I think at least it's a you know, it's a call that to try to slow down the war machine. I mean, which is really what I want to do. I mean, that what to slow it down in any way. Now, in terms of why I didn't talk about some of these things in New York, again, like my own view, and I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. But I just don't think talking much about the Soviet Union or Lenin or, you know, is going to be that helpful to a mainstream crowd. The other thing is, going into it, I knew I was braced for the fact that there were going to be a lot of very pro-Ukrainian hecklers there, you know. So I guess I probably, you know, geared my talk towards that reality, that I was trying to find common ground more than trying to go for the gusto in terms of, you know, talking about some of these more deeper issues about the Soviet Union and its collapse and all that, which I guess I feared would turn a lot of people off, more than it would gain people's support. And there were 2 local media channels there too, which again, I felt like that this would go over like a lead balloon, some of this stuff. So anyway, that was a tactical decision. I don't know. You have to make that decision sometimes. I could admit to being maybe wrong on that. I don't know. But I tried to kind of go to where I thought people could go with me towards, so that's it.
Okay, on the stack is Sharon, then Kit, Deb, Alan Miller, Marilyn Langlois, and then I'm going to put myself on the stack as well. So Sharon, if you could ask your question, please.
Thank you. Several people said things I was going to say or ask, so I will only comment briefly. I'm not surprised at all to hear you say that the Russian people you spoke with have this are completely understand what happened in the Second World War, and they have family, they can cite family they lost, because that's certainly true among Russians who lost 30 million people, but it's also true in Western Europe that people have a much more familial memory going on, which is why we have a proxy war being fought by the Ukrainians who are brainwashed by fascists, and not NATO troops there, in my opinion. And I think that Americans don't understand that at all. The history that is taught in this country is high schools and colleges is appalling about the Second World War. I know that firsthand from my son, who went through those school systems. And all he knows about the Second World War is there was a bad guy named Hitler and the United States defeated him, despite all my efforts to explain. But the familial memory is really important. And we should try to teach Americans what really happened. And I think that we as historical materialists need to have a much better way of talking to people. So about what we understand is the history of imperialism that we should no longer support, that the American people should no longer support, and it's imperialism by our own country. And that's a very difficult thing to do, but we should not shy away from it. Other people asked my question, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, and again, I agree with it. And I'll just say also at the event in New York, the good thing was there were some pretty hardcore leftists there who got up and stood up and gave a speech, and they kind of got into the more, sharper issues, which is fine. I think sometimes it's good to let that happen than maybe be the main presenter who talks about that. Though the one thing I did mention, I think I did, is that people have to realize that after World War II, the U.S., I think I mentioned Operation Paperclip, that the U.S. continued to work with the Nazis, that the U.S. really absorbed the Nazis more than they did defeat it, and that's a part of our history and of world history that has to be understood, because it continues to be a problem to this day in places like Ukraine, that the U.S. has supported Nazis, and they have kept Nazism alive, really, actively, in places like Ukraine, in places like Greece, in places like Argentina, right?
Not to mention Israel.
And Israel, yeah, it's a terrible, terrible part of history that is real. And again, people are suffering because of it in a big way, particularly in Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. The next one up is Kit. Kit, if you could.
Yes,
unmute.
can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. It's really refreshing to hear you speak here today. I was wondering if you could post your contact information or email address or website on the chat. And also, are you speaking at other venues, and where are you based? And I have a bunch of questions here. Do you speak to Russians who migrated here, and what do they think of what's going on with Putin in Ukraine? Or are they, are there any who are actually pro-Soviet that are here? Or do they buy mostly into the Western propaganda about Putin that the US government puts out? Let's see, and what is the best travel agency to use to go visit the Donbas and to go to Russia now? And let's see, were you sponsored to go to the Donbas region? And yeah, I agree with Sharon about this whole issue regarding the definition of imperialism is a problem in the left, and this needs to be defined and taken seriously by folks that understand imperialism as being a problem from the U.S. Point of view. So with that, how do we deal with publications like Jacobin, Daily Cause, and others of the left propaganda that puts out information that we're just a bunch of tankies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions there. If I forget one, just remind me. So first of all, to go to Russia, you don't need a travel agency. You do need a visa. And I went through, I just Googled, I found there's a few Russian visa agencies. I paid like $500 to get an agency to help me fill out the forms and get a visa. And it was not difficult. So that's the main thing you have to do. And then really, you don't need a travel agency. There's two ways that I know to get to Russia right now. You can take Turkish Air from the US through Istanbul to Moscow. It's expensive, but it's easy to do. You just call Turkish Airlines. Yes, it is. Well, flying to Russia directly from the US is sanctioned. You can't fly directly to Russia. You used to be able to take Aeroflot from New York to Moscow up until February. You can't do that. You can take Turkish Airlines to Turkey and then to Russia. You can do that. That's what I did. The other way to do it, and now I know you can do this, and I left a different way. I left the way Comrade Lenin came in 1917. I left through Finland. I had a friend drive me about 3.5 hours to the Helsinki airport, and I took Finnish Air back. And that you can do. You may even find a direct flight to Helsinki from a city like San Francisco. So that's the other way to do it. And you still need your visa, but you don't need a travel agency. Now, to get to Donetsk, we should talk about that. I mean, I put my email up. I have people in Russia who could help you do that. There's no travel agency going to help you do that. You're going into a conflict zone. You need help from people who know what they're doing to get you the authorization to go there. I did get help from people in Russia, private individuals. I did not go through the Ministry of Defense. Some people have done that. I went through private individuals who did help me to do that. And it was not easy. I went to Russia for 10 days and I stayed for a month because it took that long to get everything worked out to go into Donetsk. And it's a serious thing to go there. You need you should bring body armor and a helmet, which you probably don't have. You need people to help you with that. And there are people I can put you in touch with who can help you with that. So, but I'd rather do that, through a private chat. What was the other question? You had another question. Your first question.
Yeah. Do you speak to Russians who migrated here about what they think about Putin and what's going on in Ukraine? Do you know Russians who are pro-Soviet that are here?
Yeah, I do actually, and it all depends on it depends on when those people came to the United States. A lot of people left right after the collapse are very pro-Soviet. In fact, here in town, there were, I think, probably a lot of past. But I actually did a little video thing interviewing a bunch of Soviet veterans who fought in the Great Patriotic War. And every year on May 9th, they'd have a party and they'd wear their uniforms and their medals, and they all had pictures of Stalin on their wall and stuff like that. That was from that era. I would say, newer immigrants are probably less pro-Soviet and probably not also pro-Putin. I think the younger people coming, particularly right now, are leaving because they don't want to be mobilized, and these are going to be more antis. So again, it does depend on age and what wave of immigration you took to come here. Oh, the other question is like, when do I speak? Yeah, I speak. Actually, just today I got invited by the UNAC group in San Francisco who said they might want to sponsor me. So maybe I'll end up in the Bay Area at a UNAC event. So,
Okay, and where are you based?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's see. The next person is Dev, please.
Oh, hi, Dan. I just wanted to know if you can say something about the Wagner Group and who are these people and what is their role there and their relation with the Russian military?
Yeah, so I don't know tons, but here's what I know. They are kind of the, I would say they're kind of the analogous organization to Blackwater in the U.S. It is a private military organization that gets funding from the Russian government to fight, and they are fighting. They're kind of more the elite fighters on the front lines in the Donbas. They get their name from Wagner, of course, the conductor, because first of all, one of the people that founded the group has the name Wagner, but also because they say they're known as the orchestrators, or they're conducting the orchestra. They see themselves as this elite military force, and so they named themselves after another composer and conductor, Wagner. By the way, now there's a Western private military group that's called themselves Mozart in response to that. I mean, they're an elite fighting force. I think they're seen as very good at what they do and very important to the struggle, but they are a private force that gets funding from the Russian government.
Okay, then the next person is Alan Miller.
Hey, Dan, thank you for a very informative presentation. This has come up in a couple of questions already, but I'd like to ask you to comment on what's your take on how this question has come down on the left here in the U.S., if you have any comments on that.
Well, obviously, this is a very contentious issue amongst the left. I was just talking to folks in New York about this, just that it seems to me this is one of those issues that has really divided and undermined the left. It's very confused, I believe, about issues like Syria was a big issue like that, Libya, Nicaragua, now this. I mean, this is probably the most contentious issue where it's even hard to talk to people, even leftists, about it without getting a very emotional reaction. Obviously, there are some on the left that take the position, this has already been alluded to, that, oh, Russia's just another imperial power, and this is an inter-imperialist war like World War I, right? That is a big position amongst the left. Not only in the U.S., but amongst other leftists outside of Russia. I disagree with that point of view, but that is a point of view that's, pretty common. And so, of course, those people have a different view. But I also think, look, so it's a problem, obviously, but I think the one thing that should unite the left at least is the following. Whatever you think of Russia and the nature of Russia, and even its special operations, we should at least be able to agree on no nuclear war, no use of nuclear weapons by the West, no funding of NATO, of the military in Ukraine, And yeah, maybe this is contentious, call on the U.S. instead to support negotiations. We should at least have some common ground here, even amongst people who are so against Russia, and I think it's going to be hard to convince anyone who thinks Russia is imperialist that they're not imperialist. And even to me, it's kind of irrelevant. I mean, even during World War II, the U.S. was imperialist, Britain was imperialist, but we weren't rooting against them in World War II. At least not many people were. So to me, it's not even like, it's kind of neither here nor there. But, the problem is the left is confused generally. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, I don't even know what the left is, or anymore. I mean, in the West or in the U.S. I mean, it's
Dan, we've lost your audio again.
Sorry, that was my mistake. Recording stop was accidental.
That's okay. I mean, I think what's happening with the Russia situation is just more symptom.
Lost your voice. Turn off your video.
Turn off your video and try it, start over, Dan. We lost your audio. Still don't have any audio, Dan.
Okay. I'll turn off my video.
Well, now you're back.
Okay. Just that I was saying that the confusion about what's happening in Ukraine amongst the left is really just really the manifestation of a left that's generally confused about the world and about the struggle. And again, I think dating back certainly to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which really confused people. I mean, I think whatever you thought about the Soviet Union, it was kind of a due north for the left. At least how you related to it gave you a certain, you knew where you were. And I think people don't know where they are anymore. And that's really the bigger problem.
Okay, let's see. The next person on the stack is Marilyn. Then I'm going to speak, and then Raj.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate your presentation. It was excellent, and I appreciated your remarks about attitudes about the Soviet Union and the Soviet identity. Very helpful. My question is this, regarding the arms industry. We know that the huge amounts of money being appropriated by the U.S. Congress to support Ukraine is, most of it is just being funneled right into the coffers of the U.S. arms industry and making astronomical profits and private fortunes and all of that. In Russia, I have heard, and I want to, see if this is correct. I've heard that they have sometime in the spring or summer, they actually nationalized all of their arms industry, so that while Russia is capitalist, it's not, officially communist anymore, but the arms industry has been nationalized, so that would tell me that it's being used to benefit the overall state and not to enrich a lot of private individuals. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, you raised some excellent points, by the way. Thank you. So one, I do want to say, in fact, I gave a presentation to this UN Security Council on the first issue. I think Roger sent a video of that around via email, and talked about the fact that the U.S. barely knows where its weapons are going. That as of November 1st, the Washington Post reported that the U.S. could only account for about 10% of the weapons it sent to Ukraine. And of course, for the reason you said, because they don't care where the weapons go. Once the money goes to the defense industry, the job's done, right? We don't even care if the weapons work, right? There's that jet, is it what, the F-35 or whatever? We spent $1 trillion on it, doesn't even work. Who cares, right? Because then they got the money. So that's a huge problem. And you're right that most of the defense industry in Russia is nationalized, which, by the way, happens during wartime. Even in capitalist countries, that often happens, right? That the one thing war does is it pushes the socialization of the economy in order to be more efficient. And that is what's happening in Russia. I think you'll see that happen even more now. So that's one of the interesting results of this conflict will be more, I think, state ownership. In Russia, I mean, my friend Roger Kiernan, who's an old commie, he was saying, and I agree with him, that he thinks that the war will radicalize Russia in many ways. It will force this nationalization. And you already hear Putin saying, we don't need the billionaires. They can leave if they want. I think it'll have interesting effects. I mean, let's remember the Bolshevik Revolution was really propelled by World War I. War is politics by other means. And there'll be some interesting things that come out of this. So thank you for your questions on that.
Cool. Thank you, Dan. By the way, Roger Kieran spoke at the library a few weeks ago, along with Joe Jamieson, on their book.
I love those guys. They're great.
They're great. I had there's so much I'd like to delve deeper with you, but one thing that you touched upon, and I thought was worthwhile talking about, maybe in a little bit more detail, is what us Marxists calls the national question, because the conflict in Ukraine has a very strong inter-ethnic aspect to it, and it's something that is very difficult to overcome. The history and the ethnic rivalry and stuff like that, and I wanted you perhaps to comment about how the national question is handled under socialism and how it's handled or used under capitalism. And I think particularly, just an anecdotal thing, in 1969, I hitchhiked through what was then Yugoslavia. And I met all these people that were my age at the time, who would later become, that generation became the leaders of when Yugoslavia broke up. But back then, all the young people that I met, you'd go to one of the republics in Yugoslavia, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, this is really interesting. We really like Serbia, but you really have to get to some of the other republics because they have all kinds of interesting foods and ethnic conditions and stuff like that. And you have to, we're just this wonderful diversity. Of course, that didn't last. And so the national question has been used as a tool by capitalists. And the socialists have another approach to that. And I was wondering if you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, well, you raise a good question. I'm glad you did, because it raises some points that people brought up in Russia. First of all, I'll say that you still have that spirit in Russia and the former republics. First of all, the old Soviet Expo is still, marketplace still exists, and it's still functioning in Moscow. I went there. So every former republic still has these stores you can go to in Moscow, in this area, that has a huge Lenin statue in the middle, by the way. And you can get food there and clothes there from Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and this sort of thing. People still feel this real kindred spirit with the other republics. I ate a lot of Georgian food while I was there. Every Russian told me the best food in Russia is Georgian food. I ate a lot of Georgian restaurants. So there is this sort of affinity that still was created by the Soviet system, right? Now, in terms of the national question, I'll tell you what I heard from a lot of people, and this really kind of blew my mind. When the subject of Vladimir Lenin came up, a lot of people were mad at Lenin over the national question. And why? Because they said, you know what, if he hadn't done this with all, creating all these republics, with semi-autonomy, we would have never collapsed, for one, and we wouldn't have all this inter-ethnic strife. I mean, they blame Lenin. Putin, you'll hear him in speeches blame Lenin for what's happening in Ukraine. He was like, because what Lenin did with the national question is he obviously tried to create one nation, but with different republics who would have their own languages, their own customs, which again was very progressive and wonderful. But the truth is it has been exploited by the West, particularly in a place like Ukraine, Chechnya, to try to drum up ethnic conflicts, right? And anti-Russian sentiment. And that's exactly what's happened in Ukraine. So it's a very the national question, as Lenin defined it and as he tried to carry it out, is pretty, that's a pretty fraught issue in Russia. And again, I think that what he was trying to do is have, to celebrate and recognize ethnic and language differences within the context of one great nation, which again, I support, and I think it was a great idea. But again, in the end, it probably did make the dismemberment of the Soviet Union more possible, maybe even more likely, because again, the West was very smart to exploit the differences and exploit the divisions. And the one thing people will tell you is the Ukraine was the most prosperous republic within the Soviet Union. They were very catered to, again, with Khrushchev giving them the Crimea and the Donbas given to them. And, and now Ukrainians, certainly in the West, forgot about that, and resent Russia and whatever. So it's a very interesting thing. This national question will be thought about a lot for a very long time to come, I think.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So we have 3 more people on the stack. Our usual procedure, which I'll be following, is that people who haven't spoken get put to the top of the stack. So the stack now is Norma.
Just to interrupt you, Roger, I was going to follow up on this national question, so it's
Yeah,
okay.
I was going to follow up on a lot of stuff too.
So no, just on this one we just discussed, but it's your choice, whatever. My main comment was on this.
Okay.
Continuity, that's all. I can take the back seat. There's no problem. I can come.
Yeah,
back.
so I think we'll do Norma, then Mehmet, then Raj, if you don't mind, and then we'll ask Dan if you'd like to sum up things and leave us with some final words. And then we often go past the 12:30 mark, and if you will be willing, I think there's going to be a lot of interest to go past that, but that's up to you. I know you've this is now the 4th hour on Zoom for you, so or maybe 5th. So it's a long time. So Norma, if you could take it up.
Oh, let's see. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I wonder what, Dan, this has been delightful. These are my songs I've been singing for decades.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. For going there. I just made it up out of thin air because I was right. I was actually well informed. I've heard from people for ages now how the people that are still in Soviet Union, what was her name? Tennyson started writing that book about how she helped everybody that wanted to convert to using big business as a way to get ahead. And she helped them. Do you know her book? Anyway, I want to ask, do you think that the people in the vicinity, if you ask them, because it's been thrown off, somebody said, oh, well, Russia's capitalist, and I think people from this site will also say, oh, China's capitalist. Do you think if you ask the people who live there, if they're capitalists, that they would say yes?
I think they would agree that Russia itself has a capitalist system. I don't think the
But
average.
that's different, because if you still are working on communism, I mean, I hear you, that's what happens. Everybody does that, you're right. And I'd like to make the distinction that because they're using a capitalist system of managing to get along and survive in this world, doesn't mean that they're capitalists. I mean, I'm a communist, but I'm no way I'm no way able to practice communism, right? I'm stuck in the capitalist world. When people say, "Oh yeah, I'm," these various things, we are living in a capitalist world, and it controls everything about our thinking, our what activities we can engage in, and so forth and so on. I mean, big business or little business is advertised or promoted as the way to get along, and it's not the answer to the way we need to live. So anyway, to the extent that I'm communist, I say that people don't think that they're capitalist in Russia or in China. They know they're in struggle.
Yeah, again, I would say that would apply to people more, from the working class and from, the agricultural sector. Again, I don't think people identify themselves individually as capitalists the way people in the U.S. do. I think people here identify with capitalism much more. The other thing is that Russia does still have socialized medicine. Medicine's free, and education is free. Even I think up at least part into college. So I mean, some of that stuff is a remnant from the Soviet Union, and people like that stuff. I mean, people don't want that stuff to go away. At the same time, I again, in terms of the struggle for socialism, how much that is a real part of Russian life, I'm not certain about that. I think people see that as a long shot. I don't know how much that's on the minds of people, whether they could restore that sort of thing. I didn't get the impression that that was a major belief that people had, that they could bring that back. But I think they also understand that unfettered capitalism for sure is not beneficial to them. And they do want those social goods that again, Russia still provides. So
do they know there's no such thing as unfettered capitalism?
Let me
finish.
Okay, let's
they
finish
know
that, but
there
we
is
really
no
need to
such
go on to some of the other questions. Okay, next up is Mehmet.
Oh, hi. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Dan, for a very informative session. Learned a lot.
Mehmet's face is frozen. Turn up your video, Mehmet.
Okay, Mehmet is frozen. Let's get Raj to go on, and then that'll be our last formal question. And
okay. I think.
Oh, Mehmet, you're back.
Oh, okay, back. All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. The question is, Russia has a lot of billionaires and oligarchs, and their interest clearly lies in being a part of the international capital, which is controlled by imperialists. So there is definitely a conflict on the side of the Russian bourgeoisie on which side to take. And it looks like they have taken a huge risk being with Putin because things could go either way. It looks like it's going pretty good now, but they have taken some hits. I was just in Turkey, came back. and in Bodrum, especially a Mediterranean town at the sea coast, and there is a lot of Russian yachts. Looks like they are $100 million yachts just waiting there, away from being taken over by the European Union or others. So if you could please try to explain from your perspective, why didn't the capitalists in Russia rise against Putin to join the forces of imperialism? And it looks like they stood by Russia in this latest conflict. Thank you again.
Well, you raise a great question. I don't know all the answers to that. I will say that you're correct that the billionaires, first of all, what I've read is that the billionaire class largely did not support this special operation, that Putin acted against them in carrying forward this special operation, which, by the way, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, if it were up to them, this would have happened 8 years ago, this special operation. So he didn't win any fans amongst the billionaires for doing this. And some even left. Some billionaires even left Russia because of the special operation. Now, why they didn't rebel against him? I mean, first of all, I don't think they rebelled against him up till the special operation because they were largely doing fine under him, right? They were still making their fortune and so they could live with that. Why they didn't after the special operation, I guess I don't know. And I just don't know the answer to that. And it is very interesting, though, that again, at least in terms of rhetoric, Putin is now speaking out against the billionaires, right? Again, I don't know if that's rhetoric only or there'll be something done about that, but I think you will see increasing conflict between the billionaires and the government of Russia and the people of Russia. That's all I can say. I think that conflict is becoming more sharp, and time will tell how that's going to play out.
Okay, well, thank you, Dave. It's now a little bit past 12:30, and I know our original labor contract with you was to 12:30. Of course, we pay you time and a half if you go past that, our time, but unfortunately, we don't pay you time and a half times zero is not a very good living wage. I know you have a lot of things going, and you've been on Zoom for a long, long time. Can you stay with us a little bit longer, or do you have to go?
I actually do need to go. I have a date with my sons to spend some time with them this afternoon.
So this is what we'll do. We'll continue the open discussion without Dan. But Dan, would you like to make some final comments before you have to leave?
Well, I think the main thing is, and I said this today at the U.S. Peace Council meeting that, it's a Chinese curse, I guess, that, may you live in interesting times. But at this point, I see it as a blessing. We live in very interesting times. And after particularly being in Donetsk, I felt like that was a blessing, that things are interesting in a possibly good way. Yes, a possibly catastrophic way, no question. But I do think the times are changing. I think we're seeing the, birth of a new world for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not going to be the same as it was. I think it's going to be interesting. I think potentially better. Now there's going to be a lot of growing pains and a lot of suffering, sadly, as that new world comes to being. But I have a certain optimism that I haven't had in a long time, to be honest. And if there's anything I could end with is that I do think there's reasons to be hopeful. And I think as revolutionaries, I think the best, what do they say? I forget. There's a great expression that I'm probably going to be, you have to be, in a way, realistically, you have to be a pessimist, but I think the only way to keep going is to have a certain optimism and hope. And I have that. And I hope that if in any way I brought you a little hope with these facts, then I've done my job. I think there's reasons to be hopeful for the future. I think a better world is in store. So thank you. And with that, Happy New Year to everyone.
Dan, thank you so much for coming. And I think I expressed a sentiment for the entire Marxist Library community. We very much appreciated you joining us today and look forward to the next time that you can join us. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll continue without Dan, and I'll call on Raj.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.